chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4, we'll read verses 1 through 3 and then verses 17 through 21. Ephesians 4, verses 1 through 3. I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech ye that you walk worthy of the vocation wherewith ye are called, with all lowliness and meekness, with longsuffering, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Then in verse 17 through verse 21, this I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling have given themselves over unto lasciviousness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. But ye have not so learned Christ, if so be that ye have heard him and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus. What we read in verse 1 again commences the practical or application portion of the Ephesian letter. The application of the truth that is stated in chapters 1 through 3. Again, Paul spent 3 chapters telling us what God has done for us, what he has given us, what he has provided for us in the saving of our soul. And now he says, I therefore, or consequently, because of that, on that ground, beseech you that you walk worthy, becoming, suitable to, in a manner fitting of the vocation, the function, the occupation, the business, wherewith, by means of which, ye are called. So he's telling them, make it your function, your occupation, your business in life, to live life in harmony with your call to salvation. What is said in verse 1 establishes the context, not only of this chapter, but establishes the context of the remaining chapters, the remaining part of the letter. That is, the context is walk as children of God. That is, have a walk that is becoming of one saved by the grace of God. Walk step in step with God as those who know him. He proceeds in verse 2 to speak of the spirit of this walk, and from there through verse 16, he's telling the Ephesian church, you are one in Christ, be one in life lived. That is, everyone walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you're called. Know what a church it would be if that was the case. In our text, beginning with verse 17, Paul deals with the subject. Again, the subject is established in verse 1, walk worthy of vocation wherewith you're called. Paul now begins to deal with the subject that was established there in verse 1 from the negative. And that is seen in the words in verse 17, not as. Walk not as. So he's dealing with the same subject, except now he's approaching it from the negative. And then in verses 22 through verse 20 of chapter 6, he details some specifics, some details, some aspects of what was established in verse 1 and what is established in verse 17. So in this message, we want to focus upon Paul dealing with the Christian life or our walk from the negative in verses 17 through 19. The subject is living above spiritual futility. Again, the context is established in verse 1. Walk as children of God. And such is a life above spiritual emptiness and spiritual futility. If life is spiritually empty, you're not doing it right. Very simple. So consider first of all the importance and the manner of the exhortation. Again, it's expressed in verse 1, the importance, by the word beseech, meaning to beg, to plead, to implore. It is a word that indicates importance. It is a word that indicates the urgency of the matter. Now, going to the negative aspect, in verse 17, we see the importance is expressed by that word testify. Testify, to solemnly declare. The word testify is a call to attention, indicative of something important, indicative of a serious matter. And then there is the phrase, in the Lord. Paul says, I testify in the Lord. This indicates that what is about to be said, he had heard from the Lord. That makes it important. It was not his own message. It was not his own idea. It was not his own thought. It was not his own opinion. He says, I testify in the Lord. So what he's about to say in the Lord speaks of He's the source. The Lord is the source of what he's about to say. The Lord is the authority of what he is about to say. I testify in the Lord. Again, it's indicative of the importance. It's indicative of the significance of what is going to follow. Now, the manner of this walk or life in harmony with what the Lord has done for us in salvation, this is seen from verses 2 and 3. We are to walk worthy of the vocation which you're called, with all lowliness. That is, humility, without any arrogance, without any pride. Notice, keep a mark there and go to Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, not just outward, lowliness in mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. And this walk, this life that we are being implored to live, is to be with all lowliness. And then there's the word meekness back in Ephesians 4. A result of the lowliness. And the meekness is twofold. There is a meekness toward God, and there is a meekness toward man. If you have meekness toward God, you will have meekness toward man. They go together. Toward God, it's simply taking our proper place before Him. It would involve self-denial. It would involve submission to God. It would involve contentment before God and an inward submission of the heart. So it's the quiet of the heart before God, freely submitting and taking pleasure in God's will, God's disposal, as opposed to murmuring at the hand of God. Anyone who murmurs is not meek before God, because meek before God is taking our place before God, being content. So it's opposed to murmuring, it's opposed to fretting, it's opposed to an unsettled and an unstable spirit. It would be opposed to consuming cares, the cares of the world that consume us. And then, of course, there's a meekness toward man, which is the opposite of ill will toward man. And it would be opposed to harshness of spirit. It would be opposed to malice. It would be opposed to envy and bitterness and wrath and anger and evil speaking. And anyone who knows anything knows that any one of those things will destroy your walk. It will prevent you from living the life that you live. So he goes on, he says, with lowliness and meekness, with long suffering, that's bearing the trials and difficulties of life. And then he goes on, forbearing one another in love. That's bearing patiently with the shortcomings of others, bearing patiently with them. And then we go to verse 3, and it's endeavoring to. So it speaks of exertion and effort, and that for a purpose, endeavoring to. In this case, keeping the unity of the Spirit. So endeavoring is striving to achieve. And this is the spirit in which we are to live, verse 1. It's also, the importance is also, or the manner is also seen from the negative aspect of the exhortation. Notice in verse 17, that ye henceforth, from this point on, indicative that a change has taken place. This also is referred to back in verse 14, that we henceforth be no more. So he's approaching it from the negative there as well. Henceforth, indicative of change in life. And in verse 22, there are the words that you put off concerning the former conversation. So again, the manner of this life is a change has taken place. Without this change taking place, you cannot live the life of verse 1 or verse 17 from the negative. The extent of the exhortation is seen in the word walk. We see it in verse 1. We see it again in verse 17. It's indicative of our entire life. Would include our thoughts, would include our behavior, both public and private. A walk, of course, is made up of individual steps, and every step is included in what we read here. Every one of our steps. What we read here in Ephesians 4:1, verse 17 through 19, is for every step. So it's an all-inclusive statement, step after step. Also, from our text, words mind, understanding, and heart. And those words, of course, reveal the inward aspect of what is being exhorted from the negative. And this inward aspect, of course, translates into our outward walk. What is exhorted here also involves the effectual working. Back in verse 16, according to the effectual working, the measure of every part. It's the power of God within. So here in verse 17 through verse 19, there's a pattern. Again, this is what we're to avoid. What we see in verses 17 through 19 is what we are to avoid. But there's a pattern that is presented. It would do you well to always observe patterns. The Bible's filled with them. And if you carefully observe patterns in your own life or in the life of others, this is what it's going to lead to. There are no exceptions. You follow a certain pattern, And this is where you're going to end up. If there's not a break in the pattern, this is what's going to happen. And God's people all the time, they act shocked when such and such happens. They've been following the pattern all along. What do you expect? What do you expect? Well, they expect to be the exception to the pattern. But it's a pattern. You're not, if you follow the pattern, you're not going to be the exception. So he presents a pattern here. It's a very definite pattern. And again, it's something not as. In other words, we're not to follow this pattern. And if we're going to live the life of verse 1, don't follow this pattern that's presented. So the exhortation is, from the negative, walk not as other Gentiles walk. Again, this is verse 1 approached from the negative. Verse 1 is the context. In verse 1, if verse 1 is so, then what we read here in verses 17 through 19 will be so as well. So following the exhortation, walk not as other Gentiles walk. There is a description of their walk. There is a description of their life, and it follows a pattern. Again, looking at this description, there is a very definite pattern concerning the life of these other Gentiles. Other Gentiles. In order to obey the exhortation, we must avoid falling into the pattern that is presented. And we all fall into patterns. We all have a pattern for our life. That pattern can change. The overall walk is described in verse 17 by the words, in the vanity of their mind. That describes their walk. That describes their life. It is a life of vanity. In the vanity of their mind. Now that's not limited to thoughts. It would also include their will, their desires. It's all vanity. They're chasing after the wrong thing. Their whole life is marked by vanity. It is a word that has reference to their approach to life. It is the basis or the foundation of their approach to life. It's built upon vanity, emptiness, no purpose, chasing after that which does not matter, getting upset about things that do not matter. This is their life. And in the end, it all proves to be empty. So their whole attitude toward life, their focus in life is the temporary. That's true of every unsaved sinner. It's also true of many a saved sinner. But that's the focus. That's the foundation. The temporary. It is a self-centered life. Desiring to satisfy self-desires. I want to do such and such. I'm going to do such and such regardless. It is a life about self. It is a life about appearances. It is a life about status. It is a life about being somebody. It is a life about possessing things. It is a life of personal gain. It is a life of keeping up with others, doing whatever you can for yourselves, get more, keep more. It is like children chasing bubbles. What do you have when you catch it? Nothing. It's gone. Just last week, we were in Elgin, a bubble machine. I watched all the little kids chasing bubbles. Nothing unusual about that. That's what children do. Now, if I would have seen adults do it, I would have thought, wow. But that's what people do that should be spiritual adults, and they're out there doing what? Chasing bubbles. Chasing bubbles. Chasing that when you catch it, you don't have anything. It's all vanity. It's all vanity. It's futility. And we're all prone to such. No wonder the psalmist prayed in Psalm 119:37, "Turn away mine eyes from beholding vanity." And the solution, "Quicken thou me in thy way." The vanity of the mind is the basis of life for the worldling. But we are to live differently. Our life should not be summed up by the word vanity. Ours is to be a life of distinction, a life of contrast. Again, not as. And then notice the pattern. Walk not as other Gentiles walk in the vanity of their mind. And then we have the pattern. Having the understanding darkened. Their understanding of what matters is darkened. A deep darkness that swallows up the ability to comprehend what really matters in life. When our understanding is darkened, we're now beginning to fail to comprehend what really matters. We're starting that pattern. The unregenerate state, as we saw this morning, is a state of darkness. It's the condition of all by nature. We were born in darkness. We walked in darkness. We're covered with darkness. We're full of darkness. We love the darkness. According to John 3, verses 19 and 20. Because our deeds were evil. We were darkness. Ephesians 5, verse 8, "For ye were sometimes darkness." Not in darkness, you were darkness. This darkness that we were in, this darkness that we walked and sat in, this darkness that we were covered with and full of and that we loved, was so powerful. It was so great. It was so thick that Jesus said in John 1, verse 5, "And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not." That's dark. That's dark. And when your mind, your understanding, has no longer the ability to comprehend what matters, you're going to walk as other Gentiles walk, having the understanding darkened. But then notice the next step in the pattern. Having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God. The word being speaks of an active state of being. Being alienated from the life of God. And it's an ongoing thing, being. And that alienated simply means separated. Separated from God. In Ephesians 2:17, it is said to be afar off. It is separated afar off from a life in which God is the source. It is a life unlike God, alienated from the life of God. The understanding is darkened. They cannot comprehend. And now they have a life that does not think about God, does not listen to God, does not obey God, does not serve God, does not love God. That cannot end well. And that's the pattern that's being established. It's a life indifferent toward God. And it goes back to having their understanding darkened. They fail to comprehend. That's why people will say all the time, pray for my son, pray for my daughter. They're living in sin and they know better. No, they don't. No, they don't. If they knew better, they wouldn't be doing it. Don't you understand? Their understanding has become darkened. They do not comprehend. What did Jesus say to the woman at the well? If you knew, ye would. And that's true still today. Oh, they know better. They know better. They know the truth. No, they don't. They may have known it one time, but they're disregarding it now because they're in this pattern. Their understanding is being darkened, being led away from God. Walk not as other Gentiles walk. Do not allow yourself to be assimilated into the world system. The current of the world is always away from God. Always. I didn't say it was away from religion, but it's always away from God. Ephesians 2 verse 12, without Christ, without God. What is that? That is a secular life. We must not get caught in the process of secularization. And where does it begin? Having the understanding darkened. A failure to comprehend. Losing sight of what is important. Secularization. Going on all the time, all around us. Has my entire life. It is the process of separating from connection to the Lord. It is, and again, it is a process. It is the process of removing the influence of God from your life. It's a process. And it begins with having the understanding darkened. You don't even know when it's going on. You don't even know when this process is going on. Others may be able to see it, but you can't see it because your understanding is darkened. It is the process of de-Christianization. It's the process of that. The process of moving from the spiritual to the temporal. And Paul is saying, don't do that. Ours is to be a life for God, a life focused upon God, a life purposed for God. So here's the pattern. The understanding is darkened. The influence of God is now removed from life. Then notice, through. Okay, now he's going to explain how this alienation, how this life without God comes about. It comes through. And how it grows. Through the ignorance that is in them. Through the ignorance that is in them. So this living life without God comes through a deep-seated ignorance which follows having your understanding darkened. A deep-seated ignorance that is in them. What is ignorance? Well, it's unawareness. It's unawareness. It's obliviousness. In this case, it's an unawareness of God. It's an oblivion of God. Your understanding is darkened. That leads you to have a life where God is not much of an influence, and this comes through ignorance and unawareness and oblivion of God. And then notice the next word. Because. Here's the reason. Here's the reason for the ignorance. Because. Stating the reason for the spiritual comprehension being swallowed up in darkness. Stating the reason for the alienation from God. Stating the reason for the unawareness and oblivion of God. Because of the blindness of their heart. It's not because circumstances changed. It has nothing to do with it. It is not because of brother or sister so-and-so. It's because of the blindness of their heart. And notice it doesn't just say because of the blindness of heart, but the blindness of their heart. Now, this blindness of heart is simply a hardness of heart toward God, and is explained in the next phrase, who being past feeling. Notice again the word being. Who being, ongoing. This blindness of heart, or hardness of heart, causes one, eventually, you follow the pattern long enough, and they're past feeling. They're past feeling. You see, you get people who will say and try to defend their sinful lifestyle. Well, God hasn't spoken to me about it. Oh, He has. But you're past feeling. You're past feeling. You followed this pattern so long that you're past feeling. You're insensitive toward God. Paul said in 1 Timothy 4:2, having their conscience seared, sealed shut with a hot iron. It's insensitivity toward God. That's the way of the world. And there's a pattern to get there for the child of God. And that is having your understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God. God's no longer an influence. This is through the ignorance or just unawareness of God in your daily life. This hardens your heart. And eventually, this hardness of heart, these things don't happen overnight. This hardness of heart leads to an insensitivity toward God. I mean, these are people who could sit in the front row of a church and you can call them out by name. They still wouldn't feel guilty because their heart is so hard. So this hardness of heart, insensitivity toward God, leads to all kinds of perversion and sinful action. It leads to a defying of God, seeking to exalt man and to throw down God. Notice what it says. Having, or have, who being past feeling, have given themselves over. What sad words. All of this leads to have given themselves. They've given themselves. They've done this voluntarily. Haven't been forced. They have given themselves voluntarily over unto. And all the things that those who profess to be saved have given themselves over unto. It didn't happen overnight. They followed a pattern. You follow the pattern, eventually you'll get to this place. I've had God's people, I know, Brother Dan, I'm not living like I ought to, but I'll never do such and such. Oh, yes, you will. Because you're following that pattern. This is where you're going to end up. Because you're following a pattern. You are not going to be the exception. You follow the pattern, you're going to get to the end of the pattern. Have given themselves voluntarily over unto. That tells me they've surrendered their lives to something. They offer no resistance. Desiring and following after, and notice what it is. Lasciviousness, shameless acts, sensuality. They've given themselves over unto these things. They're no longer wrong. They don't have a problem with it. And then notice the next word, to work. They've given themselves over unto lasciviousness to work. They make it their business to work all uncleanness impurity. God's people, do they mean to get there? No. That's why people say, oh, I never meant this to happen. But you followed the pattern. You may not have meant for it to happen, but what did you expect to happen? You followed this pattern. It's going to happen. The pattern needs to be broken. That's the only remedy. To work. They make uncleanness, they make impurity their business. But it gets worse. They do so with greediness. That is a desire to continue in that lifestyle, a desire to have more uncleanness. Paul is saying, don't walk like that. Don't live like that. That's how the world lives. You don't do that. And if you see yourselves falling into that pattern, you pray that the Lord break the pattern. Notice in Proverbs 28, verse 14. Proverbs 28. Verse 14. Happy is the man that feareth always, but he that hardeneth his heart shall, no doubt about it, shall fall into mischief, shall fall into trouble. Proverbs 29, verse 1. He that being often reproved hardeneth his neck shall suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. What a warning. And that without remedy. In Acts chapter 28, verse 27. Acts 28, verse 27. For the heart of this people is waxed gross. That is, it's hard. And their ears are dull of hearing. They've hardened their heart. They do not hear. They're tired of hearing. And their eyes have they closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and should be converted, and I should heal them. There's a pattern. There's a pattern that gets there. And Paul, here in Ephesians, if you're going to live Ephesians 4, verse 1, you have to also live Ephesians 4, verse 17. This entire pattern, if you go back to Ephesians 4, that is presented in verses 17 through 19, is contrary to Christ. He says in verse 20, but ye have not so learned Christ. You didn't learn that pattern from Him. We have been taught to abandon such a course. So what is the way to obeying verses 17 through 19? Well, it's the antithesis in verse 1 and verse 2. It is a maintaining of lowliness. If you do not maintain lowliness, you're going to fall in the wrong pattern. It is a maintaining of meekness. It is a maintaining of forbearing in love and endeavoring. And desiring in verse 16 to contribute spiritually to the well-being of the Lord's church. If we're going to avoid what is written in verses 17 through 19, we must not get caught up with vain thoughts. We must not allow spiritual comprehension to be swallowed up. How do you do that? You stay near to God. You stay aware of God. You do not fall into ignorance. And the root of it all is you do not allow hardness of heart. That is, you keep the heart tender. never surrendering yourselves to the ways of the world, never surrendering yourself to the process of secularization, always being aware of the teaching of Christ. We see that in verse 21, if so be that ye have heard Him and have been taught by Him the truth, as the truth is in Jesus. You can't get away from Christ. Never surrender yourselves to the ways of the world. Always be aware of the teaching of Christ. Never stop learning the teaching of Christ. And that is the way to not fall into this pattern of verses 17 through 19. So what we have here in verse 1 is that our walk, our life, is to be becoming of our salvation experience, that calling, and that involves the negative aspect of not following this pattern that is presented. How do you break a pattern? Well, as soon as you see a pattern developing that is not of Christ, you need to stop it right there. And if you don't, it will eventually move to the next step. And I believe when God's people fall into these ruinous patterns, God does speak. And there are times during that pattern that God speaks. But depending on how far you've moved down in the pattern, you don't hear. You don't hear. And the pattern continues. And you will not only bring ruin to your own life, you will have an adverse effect upon others as well. So the way to live our life is Ephesians 4:1. Walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you're called. A lot of other callings out there, a lot of other voices, a lot of other pulls. Not as. Not as. Not as. I'm not to be as them. Not as. Not as. And the solution is Ephesians 4, verse 1. God help us to recognize sinful patterns when they occur in our life. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us in verse of song.